Hi, I'm your host Vasco Duarte. Welcome to the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, where we share tips and tricks from Scrum Masters around the world. Every day, we bring you inspiring answers to important questions that all Scrum Masters face day after day. Hello, everybody. Welcome to one more week of the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast. And this week, joining us from Florida in the US is Matthew Green. Hi, Matthew. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Vasco. Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. We were just talking about how the world is filled with amazing podcasts that help Scrum Masters before we started recording. And when we were talking about the past with Matthew, he said that before he became a Scrum Master, he worked in a variety of roles inside and outside IT. And so he has a very eclectic background that has served him while working with teams and individuals in their journey, right? And this podcast is here to do the same. Matthew, that was a short intro to you. I think we dive into helping our listeners right away. Tell us a little bit more about your journey, your eclectic journey as you described it. How did you end up becoming a Scrum Master?
Well, I've done a lot of different things in my career, mostly in the IT side, but I've worked on both IT and business. And I got into being a Scrum Master back in 2007 by complete blind luck. I was working in an organization where I was on the business side. I was effectively a BA at the time, and the IT group was working towards becoming agile. Back then, they were adopting Scrum and doing some of those early things. And my boss, because we knew we were going to be partnering with that IT group, decided that he needed to have some people that understood the framework as well. And so he sent me to a CSM class. So I got that CSM tag, and then I entered into the 3 years of what I call wandering in the woods, which is I wasn't really in a formal Scrum Master role, but I was taking the different parts of the framework and to try to apply them to my context, which you don't think of as being training for being a Scrum Master, but it's actually excellent training for being Scrum Master because it's small experiments in a controlled environment. You get to see how things work and where they don't work. And, I didn't expect that to happen. And I just sort of kept building that. And then I took a new job with a startup and they needed a Scrum Master. And lo and behold, I had the Scrum Master tag. And that's when I first started getting into the formal role of being a Scrum Master and learning what that really meant outside of what the certification class is. Because it's one thing when you've got a real team in front of you, and it's a different thing in the class when you're learning the mechanics of the framework.
Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why we interview so many Scrum Masters here on the podcast. It's exactly because of that, right? Because real life is totally different from the class. And the class is important. We get a lot of learning and, we ask questions, we hear other people's experiences. So we learn and we become better as Scrum Masters. I'm a very big fan of going to several Scrum Master trainings with different trainers to exactly experience that different perspective. Now, of course, that's the beginning of the journey. At least for you, it was the beginning of the journey. But ultimately, we get our hands dirty, and sometimes we fall flat on our face as well. And that's just part of being a Scrum Master. We need to try things all the time, and sometimes those things don't go as we expect. So, Matthew, today's Fail Monday here on the podcast, and we want to explore one of those stories, one of a difficult moment you had as a Scrum Master. We'll dive into the conclusions and the analysis later on, but walk us through that story, step by step. Take us on that journey that you were in at the time.
So I had made a decision that I needed to start working at a scale other than a startup. I needed to get some experience with big. So I'd taken an opportunity with an organization that was quite large, Fortune 50 size company, well-defined. So I went in as a new Scrum Master, as a senior Scrum Master, and was met at the door. I was assigned 3 COBOL teams.
COBOL teams, wow.
Well, I'm an old COBOL programmer, so I at least know how to speak the language. So they met me at the door saying, we're COBOL programmers, Scrum doesn't work here. So you sort of got an idea of the environment that you're walking into. And I saw the failure is really my failure. So it's sort of that growth as a Scrum Master of my failure was I saw my job as to get them to change rather than to help them to change.
And how did that go? Like, walk us through that. So you were met at the door. You were basically told you're not welcome, but it was your job anyway. So you went into it. And what started happening? Like, walk us through the first few meetings, the first sprint. How did that go?
Well, so there's a lot of education up front. You're getting a lot of resistance of, well, I don't understand, don't understand why we're doing this. This doesn't make any sense to me. They never really come out and say, I don't understand why. They say this doesn't make any sense. Because those are two different things. We couldn't get enough stories built up so that we could start a meaningful sprint. So there was a lot of delay. And the rest of the environment was they had a lot of deadline pressure on them because they had to merge two systems as part of a merger to be one system so that they could complete the merger and have some financial things that were tied to that. So the team was under an intense amount of pressure as well. And so you had to read the room in order to be able to do it. So, the first steps were to start relationship building, but it took me a while to get there.
What do you mean by relationship building?
You have to have trust. It's not Matt the Scrum Master, it's Matt the person. I have things that I bring to the table, just like they have things that they bring to the table, and that we can all find a way to make their lives better. And I didn't understand that as sort of my purpose, but that's really where I drive today is how do I make people's lives better? But I was running into that. So my failure in a nutshell was the organization did one thing really great. They framed the Scrum Master as the coach for the team rather than the Agile coach from the outside being the coach for the team. But I didn't understand coaching. I had no idea what it meant. Coaching to me was telling people how to do things. And then when they didn't want to do those things, so I spent a lot of time just banging my head against the wall, trying to tell them, well, you need to change how you're doing things instead of asking them how they might change and what result they might get that's different or better. And it was all part of breaking those habits.
One of the things that I get from this story is, of course, now you have the benefit of hindsight. Now you know that you had the approach that was not going to succeed. Sometimes that approach succeeds. By the way, for example, if you meet a very willing team, a team that already wants to do it, right? And then they even help you learn as a Scrum Master by pushing you and forcing you to think about different circumstances. But in this case, that was not the situation. This was a resisting team, a team that didn't see the why of adopting Scrum. And one of the things that I consider is, all right, we are going to meet this type of teams. It's inevitable. If you're a successful Scrum Master, you will meet even more because those are the difficult teams and we put the best people in the toughest situations, right? So we want to be ready for that. You already gave us a brilliant tip, right? Start by building relationships and make people's lives better. But when you go into a situation like that today, Matthew, what do you take with you? How would you approach this situation again if you were put back in the same spot as you were at the time?
Well, so I took a great lesson out of it. It was probably one of my best learning experiences, and that's the power of why. So I channeled my inner Simon Sinek. And the practice that I started working with those teams was as a Scrum Master, I started every event with a 30-second why script, which is why are we doing this event? What is the value and what is the expected outcome? And I did that every event, every week, every day for 9 months for 3 teams. And that repetition built muscle memory. It helped people understand the why. They may not have agreed with the why, and that's a personal choice that they get to make. But the why was very clear. And it wasn't saying you have to do this, but it was saying this is the event. This is why it's important. This is why Scrum teams do it. And it helped them align on value of whether that event was giving them what they wanted. Now, if people disagree with the why, instead of having discussions about, well, this is stupid and useless, we get to have conversations about this really isn't getting me what I need. And I'd much rather have that latter conversation than it's just stupid and useless and should be ignored, because I'd rather focus on the gaps. But learning to ask that question to help the team understand why in a non-threatening way was the biggest value that I got out of that whole. It was one of the biggest values I got out of that whole engagement.
Absolutely. And a critical one, of course, for us that work with teams all the time that are either adopting Scrum like many might still be, but also they might be going through other changes, right? Like working with a different department, being assigned to a different product, working with a specific customer that they never worked with before. Those are all change situations. We'll talk more about that on Wednesday, but I think this is also a great change story that you shared with us. So thank you for that, Matthew.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Monday is about what we learn from our obstacles and our failures. But tomorrow is Team Tuesday here on the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast. We explore teams and their journeys, the habits they develop that threaten their performance, how each of our guests helped their teams evolve, and the one key lesson they learned from that experience. We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.